All right, this is the third video from chapter 13, and this is where it gets real interesting. This is where it takes really strong critical thinking skills and a really good understanding of the material to truly absorb this information, because this does indeed get quite complicated. And what we're going to be talking about is the ways to adjust the money supply if you're the Federal Reserve. So these are the ways the Fed can change how much money is out there in society. It's important to consider how much money it's important to consider what the Fed can do in terms of changing the money supply, because changes in the money supply are highly correlated with things like inflation rates, interest rates, real wages, and a lot of things we care about, exchange rates being another here in the U.S. So there are 4 ways the Fed can adjust the money supply that we're going to talk about. Depending on which edition of the book you have, there may be a 5th that they've included, and that one is a new one. I don't even want to talk about it, but if you see 5 in your book, just know the first 4 are the 4 that we're going to cover. So the first is open market operations. Then we're going to talk about the required reserve rate, adjusting the discount rate, and finally targeting the federal funds rate. And this video is going to focus on increasing the money supply. So I want to address the question, how can the Fed increase the money supply? And then in the next video, we might think about decreasing the money supply and how the Fed could do that. Okay, so we're just going to run through each of these, starting with open market operations. All right, open market operations. This is the purchase and sale of stuff by the Federal Reserve. Okay? And I use the generic term stuff there because it can be anything. This is when the Fed buys or sells anything. Okay? When the Fed buys or sells anything, it changes the money supply. Okay? If the Fed wants to increase the money supply, then the Fed makes open market purchases. Okay? So open market operations just generically refers to the Fed buying and selling stuff. Open market purchases refers specifically to the Fed buying things. And when the Fed buys stuff, that increases the money supply. Now, why does that increase the money supply? Well, it's pretty simple, actually. This first one and the second, the first 2 we're going to cover are pretty easy policies that the Fed can choose to do. What happens is, if the Fed buys something, the Fed uses new money. So, the money that's spent is newly created. All right, it increases the money supply because the money spent is new money. So if the Fed goes out and buys something worth $80 million, the Fed is going to have to create $80 million in new money to spend. Now, how much money is that going to create? Well, I'm just urging you to not forget about the money multiplier. If the Fed spends $80 million, that could create a lot more due to the money multiplier. All right, so that's open market purchases, and typically what the Fed buys those Treasury securities. Okay? And if you recall, Treasury securities are just governmental bonds. When the government needs to borrow money, it will ask the Fed to do that for them, and the Fed will issue them. Okay? Completely separate from that, the Fed can then go back and buy some of those bonds back. This is where it does start to get a little bit tricky. So let me show you how this works. Okay? So what we talked about so far is open market operations. That's when the Fed buys or sells something. If they want to increase the money supply, they buy stuff. It's called an open market purchase. It's called an open market purchase because they're going into the open market, just out into the world, and buying stuff. Open market purchases. If they buy something, they're using new money to make that purchase, so the money spent increases the money supply. Okay, so here's how it works. Okay, we'll call this tracking a Treasury security. At any given time, there are trillions of dollars worth of Treasury securities or governmental bonds that are outstanding. Okay? All right, so what that means is these bonds are currently active. So right now, to give you an example, the government owes me $1,500 in 2028. Okay? So that's a Treasury security. It's a governmental bond. The government's going to pay that money to me. Now, why does the government owe me money? Well, because I lended money to the government years ago. So maybe I lent $500 to the government in 2008, and in 2028 I'll get $1,500. Something like that. Okay? So what happens is the Fed will go purchase, if they want to increase the money supply, they will go purchase these bonds, these Treasury securities, from the citizens that own them. And remember, we're talking trillions of dollars that are out there that are owned by citizens, businesses, other countries, whatever. And the Fed will just go buy it from whoever's got them. All right, so what happens here is the government owes me $1,500. The Fed buys it from me for maybe $1,000 today. Okay? And that increases the money supply. The reason it increases the money supply is because this $1,000 right here is new money, money that otherwise wouldn't exist. So the Fed prints new money, or they may just type it into a computer and say the money exists. Maybe just deposit it into my checking account. It's kind of a weird thing to think about, but the Fed may just deposit the money into my checking account without actually creating any physical cash, right? After all, most money that exists is in the form of things other than cash and coins. Checking accounts, traveler's checks, savings accounts, money market mutual funds, those sorts of things. So the Fed is going to somehow increase the money supply, and this will be new money. This can create multiplier effects on top of it, so it can create a lot more money than just the $1,000 that it initially creates. All right, that's the open market purchase. That's all you need to know in terms of the money creation process. But one interesting result from this is now who owes who? Now the government owes the Fed. And the Fed's been doing this for a while, so now the government owes the Fed a lot of money. If you recall, when we went back through the discussion of governmental debt, one of the big categories of governmental debt is actually to the Fed. I don't remember the exact figure, something like $2.5 trillion or so. So $2.5 trillion or so is owed from the government to the Fed because of these open market purchases they've been making. This is interesting because the Fed could eventually just say, you know what, government? Don't worry about paying me back. After all, if they do pay the Fed back, the Fed turns its profits over to the government. So the government has basically wiped out some of its debt by the Fed buying the stuff. That's what gets really complicated. I don't want to spend too much time on it today. You get that more in your upper level classes. All right, so that's open market purchases. Again, just to go back through it one more time, open market operations, that's when the Fed buys or sells something. Traditionally, they've engaged in purchases and sales of governmental debt or governmental bonds or treasury securities. It's all the same thing, okay? A treasury security is a type of governmental bond. That's where the government gets in debt. Government needs to borrow money to build new roads or something. It issues these treasury securities. The Fed then, way after the fact, has been going and purchasing these treasury securities from just regular old citizens. And when they purchase the treasury securities, they do so with new money. So new money goes out into society, and now the government owes the Fed money. Okay? So that's open market purchases. The second one is adjusting the required reserve rate. Adjusting the required reserve rate. And if you recall, the required reserve rate, or R, is the minimum percent of deposits that a bank must hold in reserves. And in the United States right now, that's 10% in most situations, and that's the number I want you to remember, 10%. So this is actually, again, relatively simple. Open market purchases is simple. Fed buys something, new money. Lowering the required reserve rate, simple as well, okay? To increase the money supply, the Fed lowers the required reserve rate, the R, okay? And what that does is it increases the multiplier effect. This increases the multiplier effect. So, if R is 10% like it is today, and a bank has $1 million in deposits, then the maximum amount of money that gets created from those initial $1 million, okay? So again, somebody puts $1 million into the bank. The maximum amount that can be created from this is the multiplier times the amount of deposits. So you get 10 million. Okay? So in other words, if somebody puts $1 million in the bank, that could create up to $10 million in total money once you consider the fact that that money can be loaned and spent many times over. If the Fed goes in and just changes this required reserve rate to say 5%, okay? Now when somebody puts $1 million into a bank, the maximum amount of money that can create it is going to be much higher. Now the money multiplier is 1 divided by 0.05, okay? Right? It was 1 divided by 0.1 right here, which is 1 divided by the required reserve rate. But now the required reserve rate has been cut to 5%. The money multiplier is going to go up to 20. 1 divided by 0.05. So the maximum amount of money that could be created from this is now $20 million. So the bottom line is, the lower the required reserve rate is, the more money banks could create. The interesting thing about this is there is no guarantee it's going to work, because the banks could choose still to hold. Let's say banks have been holding 20% of their deposits. Well, if the Fed drops this to 5%, they may just decide to keep holding 20% of their deposits. In that case, this wouldn't be effective. But if banks are loaning almost all the money they have, this could have a big effect. This one's quite interesting because the Fed could do this at any point in time, and it would be very quick to increase the money supply, because as soon as the Fed drops the required reserve rates, the banks can choose to increase the money supply. However, the Fed hasn't done this much at all lately. The required reserve rate has not been adjusted for a long time, in fact. So this is more of a theoretical way the Fed could change the money supply. Our Federal Reserve hasn't been doing this, but they could do it at any point in time. Other countries, for example, China, this is their main policy, to change the money supply. So it'll be interesting to see moving forward if this becomes a bigger deal in the United States as well. So that's adjusting the required reserve rate. Okay, so if the Fed wants to increase the money supply, it can do open market purchases, it can lower the required reserve rate, and now we've got two more that we need to discuss. And before we do that, I need to give you some key terms. The first is called the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate. This is maybe something you've heard mentioned before. It's one of those things where when the economy's bad, it gets discussed a lot. And if you happen to follow stocks, if you're an investor or something, maybe that's something you do kind of to try to make some extra money or for fun. The federal funds rate is often discussed on things like, Fox Money, CNN Money, that sort of thing. So the federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks charge one another for overnight loans. Okay, and overnight loans just refers to the loans the banks give each other. They're called overnight loans because they tend to be very fast. What happens is a lot of times banks end up maybe loaning out too much money or getting close to loaning out too much money, and they may need to borrow. So for example, a bank maybe in this scenario here, if you count all of their deposits, maybe if they've got 100 million in deposits and they've got 9 million in reserves. What's the problem here? Problem is here they're actually breaking rules. They're holding not enough money. And if they continue to do this, they'll get punished. Okay, they're not going to get shut down or anything like that, but they'll get punished. The Fed has ways to punish these companies. So if this is Bank A, that's in that scenario, there may be another bank, Bank B, that's in this scenario. Now this bank has plenty of money that they could that they haven't done anything with. Essentially, they have excess reserves, right? If you recall, excess reserves is extra money banks sometimes choose to hold for whatever reason. Maybe they just don't think there's anybody out there they want to loan to because they don't trust them to pay them back. Maybe they're holding this money because they've got a big project planned in a few days. Who knows? Okay? But the bottom line is these banks clearly could benefit from making a trade. And what ends up happening is this bank will loan maybe $1 million to this bank that needs the cash. It's called an overnight loan because usually what would happen is the very next morning, this bank would pay them back. Now, how does that happen? How does this bank get enough money to be able to afford to pay that $1 million back the very next day? Well, banks deal with a lot of money, okay? And there's always money rolling in and rolling out. So chances are, there's a bunch of paychecks the next day that go into this bank, and now they've got plenty of cash, all right? That's typically what happens with banks is if they're under the required reserve rate, it rises up pretty quickly, okay? So what ends up happening is the Bank B would loan to Bank A. Bank A would pay them back and give them a little bit of interest. It's mutually beneficial. Bank A gets out of trouble. They now have enough money. And Bank B makes a little bit of profit off of that overnight loan. The federal funds rate refers to the loan, the interest rate the banks charge one another. Okay, so in this case, maybe they loan them $1 million at 3%. That 3% is called the federal funds rate. And banks pretty much always charge each other the same rate. There's like an equilibrium interest rate in this market. So if they're charging 3%, all of the banks are probably charging 3% for these loans. So that's the federal funds rate. The other rate that you really need to know is the discount rate. And if you recall, we said that the Fed is a lender of last resort. The Fed will loan to banks, but usually banks don't want to borrow from the Fed because the Fed charges high interest rates. The interest rate that the banks charge is called the discount rate. So this is the interest rate that the Fed charges banks. Okay? So if a bank needs money, it may look around and try to find another bank to borrow from, but maybe it has trouble finding another bank. Well, then it may borrow from the Fed. And when it borrows from the Fed, it pays the discount rate. And that's the interest rate the Fed charges. So those are two crucial interest rates in understanding the next couple things we're going to talk about. Okay, so number 3, right? We did open market operations. We did targeting, changing the required reserve rate. And the third one is adjusting the discount rate. Best way to show why this works is to give an example. Okay, so rather than trying to explain this like using definitions, I'm just going to give you an example. So example 1. Let's say that the federal funds rate is 3%. Let's say that the discount rate is 5%. In this scenario, if a bank needs to borrow, who are they going to borrow from? What do? If you need to borrow money, would you prefer to borrow at 3 or 5%? 3, right? You prefer to borrow at the lowest possible rate. So if these are the two options you have, the bank is going to choose to borrow from other banks and pay the federal funds rate, okay? By the way, you got to be careful with this terminology because to me, federal funds rate makes me think of the Federal Reserve. Discount rate doesn't make me think of anything. So I've seen a lot of students switch these, okay? You just have to remember federal funds rate is the rate the banks charge each other. Discount rate is the rate the banks are charged by the Fed, okay? So in this scenario, banks borrow from other banks. And that doesn't create any money. It doesn't create any money because the money is already out there. Okay? If one bank just loans it to another bank, that money was already in the society, so there's not new money being created, it's just money moving around. Okay? So that doesn't really do anything in terms of changing the money supply. So what the Fed can do, if it wants to get aggressive, okay, and this is still the same example, but let's see what the Fed can do. So here's where we're at. Banks are borrowing from the other banks. The banks are borrowing from other banks over and over again. This is happening all the time. Incredible amounts of money are loaned and borrowed from banks to banks in the U.S. If the Fed wants to interrupt this process, what it can do is just undercut this rate. So maybe the Fed changes its interest rate to 2.75%, 2.75%. Now, what is that going to do? Well, now banks borrow from the Fed. And where does the Fed get the money to give the banks? Out of thin air. It creates it. This is going to be brand new money. Okay? So this is going to increase the money supply right away. Okay? Since the Fed is now doing loans, they're loaning brand new money to these banks, so this increases the money supply. Okay? Now, I know what you might be thinking here. You might be thinking, well, how is this going to increase the money supply? After all, the banks eventually have to pay the money back. Well, this is a temporary measure. This increases the money supply right now, okay? But that's going to be temporary because eventually the banks are going to have to pay the Fed back. So this is the temporary measure of increasing the money supply. Okay, so that's the third way the Fed can change the money supply, specifically increase it. If the Fed wants to increase the money supply, all right, let's write down what exactly it needs to do just to give a last summary here. To increase the money supply, the Fed needs to drop the discount rate. To be clear here, this is where some students make mistakes. Just dropping the discount rate isn't necessarily going to do anything. All right? If the federal funds rate and the discount rate look like this, all Okay, 2% federal funds rate, 10% discount rate. If the Fed goes in and drops this to 3%, in this case, that wouldn't do anything because banks are still going to only borrow from other banks. All right? So to complete this statement, the Fed needs to drop the discount rate below the federal funds rate. That's what's necessary to increase the money supply. Okay? And that leads us up to our last one. Federal funds rate targeting. Federal funds rate targeting. And this is the most complicated one. It's also the most important one. This is the one the Fed actually engages in most frequently. At any given moment, the Fed is thinking about the federal funds rate and steering it just a little bit up or down. Okay? Recall that the Fed funds rate, the FFR, is determined by the banks. The federal funds rate is the rate the banks charge each other. They can charge each other whatever they want. Okay? So this is determined by the banks. But the Fed can manipulate this rate. It can manipulate the situation to incentivize a higher or lower federal funds rate. Okay? So again, the banks don't choose, or rather the Fed doesn't choose the federal funds rate, the banks do. But the Fed has a way to manipulate the situation to change what the federal funds rate is going to be. It's kind of like saying, what determines the price of cigarettes? Well, the supply and demand, the consumers and the producers. But the government can influence that market by maybe taxing cigarettes. Similar to that, okay? The Fed can just manipulate this market a bit. Generally speaking, to increase the money supply, the Fed needs to figure out a way to push the federal funds rate down. It needs to figure out a way to decrease the federal funds rate. The lower the federal funds rate, the more money is going to be created. Okay? The lower the federal funds rate, the more banks will loan, and thus the more money will be created. Remember the money expansion process from banks' perspective. When banks make loans, it increases the money supply. So if the federal funds rate is lower, banks are actually going to make more loans. Okay? So that's an introduction. To see why this works, we got to do another example. We have to do another example. All right, so what we've done so far is just introduce it. What we need to do next, because this is the hard one. What we need to do next is figure out why a low federal funds rate leads to more money. And then after that, we need to actually figure out how does the Fed do this. How does the Fed incentivize a lower federal funds rate? So we need to do all three of those things. You've got a little taste of the introduction. Now we're going to figure out number two. Why does a lower federal funds rate lead to more money? So we'll do that now. Easiest way to see this is to do another example. So let me give you an example here. Let's say in example 1, the federal funds rate is 80%, and the discount rate is 100%. Okay? Think about the situation you're in if you're a bank here. Okay? Maybe I'm a bank that has this situation. Right now I have deposits of 100 million, and I have reserves of 11 million. Now, am I breaking any rules? No, I'm not breaking any rules, am I? I've got to hold at least 10 million, and I'm choosing to hold 11 million. So I have excess reserves of $1 million. Remember, excess reserves are reserves I don't have to hold, but I'm choosing to hold. The reason why the focus here is on these excess reserves is because here's where the action is. This is the bank choosing what they're going to do. They could either hold the money or they could loan it out. Now think about what you would do if you're a bank here, okay, in this situation. Remember that at any point, people could come in and start withdrawing their money, and now you wouldn't have adequate reserves, right? If people came in and they withdrew $10 million, what that would do is it would drive your deposits to 90 million, but it would drive your reserves to 1 million. And now you're breaking rules, now you're in big trouble. What are you going to have to do to get out of this jam? You're going to have to borrow. And oh boy, you're going to have to borrow at an 80% rate. So that's going to incentivize the banks to be very careful. So here's the bottom line. Since the federal funds rate is so high, banks will be terrified of running out of money. All right, when I say running out of money, what I mean is they got to hold at least 10 million in this case. They'll be afraid that they're not doing that. Okay, so what they're going to do is they're going to choose to to hold excess reserves. Okay, so they're thinking, look, we've got an extra $1 million here. We could loan it out, but I don't want to have to borrow at 80%. So I'm going to be really careful. I'm going to hold on to this extra money. It's kind of like for you, right? Imagine if the only way you could borrow money is you would have to pay an 80% interest rate. You might be really careful then. You might decide to save extra money now. Banks operate in the same way. If they know that interest rates are this high for borrowing, they're going to hold some extra money so that this doesn't happen. So banks choose to hold excess reserves, so less money is loaned, and less money is created. Okay? So a high federal funds rate leads to less money being created. Well, let's think about the alternate scenario then. I'm just going to erase some of this discussion down here. And let's imagine this situation was changed. And let's imagine that instead of having an 80% federal funds rate, what if this federal funds rate was 0.1%? And that may sound crazy, but the federal funds rate got that low during the last recession. The Fed was really trying to encourage banks to borrow money, and the federal funds rate got driven way down. Okay, so in this scenario now, think about the bank situation. They've got an extra $1 million here, and they're trying to decide, should we loan out this extra $1 million? Well, what happens if we loan it out and then people start withdrawing their money? We're going to have to borrow. If we have to borrow, we're going to have to borrow at 0.1%. I'm not worried about that. Let's just loan all this money out, right? Let's loan the maximum amount of money we can loan, because what's the consequence? Worst case scenario, we got to borrow at 0.1%. So in this situation, the banks become very aggressive. Since the federal funds rate is so low, banks choose to loan the maximum. Or in other words, they hold no excess reserves. This allows the money multiplier to work fully, right? If you recall, when banks hold excess reserves, the money multiplier doesn't work as strongly. But if they hold no excess reserves, the money multiplier is going to work a lot better. It's going to be a lot stronger. So this is going to increase the money supply, right? More loans means more money. Simple as that. When the money's sitting in the bank, only the depositor gets to use it, right? Only the depositor can withdraw that money and spend it at some point. But if the bank takes that money and loans it out, now the original depositor still can access that money, but someone else is using it too. So it basically doubles the money supply instantaneously when that happens. So since the federal funds rate is low, banks choose to loan the maximum. They hold no excess reserves, so more loans equals more money. Okay, so why does the low federal funds rate lead to more money? Because it causes the banks to do more loans. Now we got to address the question of how does the Fed actually do this? The Fed does something called federal funds rate targeting. Okay? Meaning it can manipulate the market to target a different federal funds rate based on what it's trying to accomplish. So the question is, how does the Fed target a lower federal funds rate? If its goal is to increase the money supply, it needs to lower the federal funds rate. Lower federal funds rate means the banks make more loans themselves, leading to more money. Okay, there are three ways. The three major ways they can do that is as follows. Open market purchases, lower the required reserve rate, or drop the discount rate below the federal funds rate. That's the three things we just went over, right? We just went over these three things. This is how you increase the money supply. So this is kind of confusing because I just said these are the ways you increase the money supply, but now I'm talking about them again. Well, here's what happens, okay? Here's what happens from the Fed's perspective. The Fed, for whatever reason, chooses to increase the money supply, okay? And this is how the Fed really operates right now. If it decides it wants to increase the money supply, it does so by thinking about the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is actually the goal, okay? That's the target. That's what they're really focusing on. So the Fed decides they want to increase the money supply by lowering the federal funds rate, okay? So what it will do is it will choose either 1, 2, or 3 up here. And if it engages in one of these three things, that's going to lower the federal funds rate. Okay? So this is how the Fed actually operates. It decides to increase the money supply. Federal funds rate is how it's going to do it. Okay? That's what it's really caring about. But to do that, it's first got to do one of these other three steps. Okay? This is confusing, okay? Because you might be wondering, well, why don't they just do one of these three things? Well, the Fed's decided this is the best way to do it. It likes the federal funds rate because the federal funds rate is the rate the banks charge each other to make loans. It's not real aggressive from the Fed's perspective because the Fed isn't actively making money. If banks make more loans to one another, that's not the Fed putting more money in society. That's just more money being created by the banks. So the Fed can kind of back off and let the banks do the work. So the Fed decides it wants to do that, okay? Then it asks itself, how can I do that? It chooses one of these three methods up here. And once that happens, that will actually lead to a lower federal funds rate. This is a scenario that's got two punches to it. It's got a jab, and then it's got a big uppercut. Okay, that's what I like to tell my students. This is the jab, and here's the uppercut. Boom. This creates a little bit of money, and then you get a big creation of money from the lower federal funds rate. So there's two places where money is created. You got more money right here, and you got more money right here. Two places where it gets created. All right, so let's show how this works. We're going to go through each of these. So the first one being open market purchases. We need to see why this affects the federal funds rate. Okay? So we've already gone through this. We know what an open market purchase is. But we're thinking about specifically the federal funds rate now. So let's think about what happens here. Let's stick with a bank down here. Let's say this is a BB&T bank. Okay? It's the bank I use, so it's always the one I come up with in my head. Let's say this is a situation they have. Nice round numbers here. $100 million in deposits and reserves of $10 million. And the Fed makes open market purchases. Okay? So what does the Fed typically buy? Usually Treasury securities. So let's say the Fed buys $50 billion in Treasury securities. So this is the Fed buying these Treasury securities with new money. New money is being distributed out there into the country. Some of that money is going to end up at BB&T. The way this is going to look is there are citizens, maybe like me or you, who sells our Treasury security to the government, or to the Fed, right? They sell their Treasury security to the Fed. Now I've got my money, and I walk over to BB&T and deposit it. All right? So some of this money, some of this $50 billion goes into BB&T. And maybe now BB&T has $120 million in deposits. Okay? So it boosts the amount of deposits they have by $20 million. Immediately, it also boosts their reserves by $30 million. Because when that money comes into BB&T, it's in BB&T, right? It hasn't been loaned out yet. So there's $30 million in reserves at BB&T. So now the BB&T has a lot of excess reserves, okay? This bank only has to hold $12 million, but they're holding $30 million. And all other banks are just like this. They all have so much extra money. And since they have so much extra money, that's going to drive the federal funds rate down, okay? So what happens now is, since banks don't need to borrow, the federal funds rate decreases, okay? This is kind of hard to see, but this is getting into the critical thinking part of this lesson today. Imagine if everyone on earth doesn't need to borrow. Imagine if nobody really needs to borrow. And I'm a bank and I'm trying to loan to people who don't need to borrow money. The only way I'm going to get people to borrow is to charge them basically 0% interest. Okay? If everybody needs to borrow, maybe I can charge them 20% interest. But if no one needs to borrow, I'm going to have to charge them close to 0 to incentivize it. That's the same thing that's happening here. The banks have so much extra money they don't need to make any loans. Or excuse me, the banks have so much money they don't need to borrow. Okay? So since they don't need to borrow, the only way to get other banks to borrow from you is to give them tiny little interest rates. So this is going to drive down the federal funds rate and increase the money supply. Okay? So just like I said with the two punches, punch number one is to do the open market purchases. That increases the money supply right away. But the more important punch is that second one. The second one is the fact that now the banks drop the federal funds rate. And that's going to create even more money because now banks are going to get really aggressive with their loans. Okay? So that's one way this would work. Now let's complete the discussion here. We've got two more to do. The second one is to lower required reserve rate. Remember, the required reserve rate is the rate that the banks have to hold, okay? So this is 10% in the United States. So if we think back to that same example we just did, this is BB&T. And this is the scenario they're in, with a 10% required reserve rate. going to happen, all right, in this situation is if all the banks are like BB&T, it's probably going to be a good bit of borrowing from banks to banks. This bank is right up against that required reserve rate of 10%. So they may decide they need to borrow some money. So there's going to be a lot of borrowing from banks to banks, probably a pretty high federal funds rate as a result. If we push this required reserve rate down to 5%, okay, that's not going to change anything about this bank except now they have excess reserves. Okay, with a 5% required reserve rate, they're now holding $5 million more than they have to. Okay, so now this bank has excess reserves of 5%. Right, $5 million in excess reserves. So if all the banks suddenly have excess reserves, they don't need to borrow anymore. And since they don't need to borrow, interest rates drop. The rates the banks charge each other drop because if nobody needs to borrow, there's no competition to borrow. So the only way to get a bank to borrow from you is to offer them super low interest rates. So this, again, this drives down the federal funds rate. Okay? So again, you get two punches. The first punch is lowering the required reserve rate. That creates more money because now the banks may choose to loan out more of the money that they have. But the second punch is the federal funds rate drops. Now the banks are thinking, we might as well loan out all the money we got, right? Because if we have to borrow, it'll be at a super low federal funds rate. So two processes here increase the money supply, and they work in unison. So that's the second one. Finally, we can get to the last one here. So the third way to increase the money supply was to lower the discount rate below the federal funds rate. That's the third way the Fed can increase the money supply. So let's imagine that the discount rate is 6% and the federal funds rate is 4%. Very typical scenario. And what happens here is banks borrow from each other. Right? There are some banks loaning and some banks borrowing, okay? But it's all going bank to bank. They're not borrowing any from the Fed because the Fed is charging a higher interest rate. So what happens here is that the Fed will drop this discount rate down to maybe 3.5%. And now banks borrow from the Fed. Okay, so that's punch number one. Punch number one works because now when the banks borrow, they borrow new money from the Fed, which temporarily increases the money supply. Now, what is punch number two going to be? What's going to be the second thing that causes the money supply to go up? Well, imagine if you're a bank and you want to loan money to another bank, right? For whatever reason, I'm a bank that has a lot of extra money on hand, a lot of excess reserves, and I'm thinking, I'd really like to loan some money to these other banks. The only way to get a bank to borrow from me is I got to go below that 3.5%. The banks are going to keep borrowing from the Fed until somebody else offers them a lower rate. So what happens is that federal funds rate responds usually very quickly to that change in the discount rate. And so that federal funds rate may go to 3.4%. Just go low enough to cause the banks to borrow from other banks and not from the Fed. Okay? So this no longer allows the banks to borrow from from the Fed, which creates new money. But what it does is it stimulates more borrowing. Okay? Now banks can borrow more cheaply. So they loan more money, which creates more money. Okay, so now banks can borrow more cheaply, so they loan more money, which creates more money. Okay, so thinking about it, you got two steps here, right? Two punches. Punch number one, when the Fed drops that discount rate down, the banks borrow from the Fed. That temporarily creates more money. But this is going to permanently create more money. Now that the federal funds rate is low, now the banks are more willing to make loans. They're more willing to take on mortgages because they know if they have to borrow, now they can borrow at 3.4%. Okay? And if that's not low enough for you, remember the discount rate can just keep dropping. The Fed can do whatever they want. They could drop this to 0.5% if they really wanted this federal funds rate to get pushed down. Okay? So the Fed effectively has 4 ways to increase the money supply. Open market purchases, lowering the required reserve rate, and dropping that discount rate below the federal funds rate. Its 4th way is to lower the federal funds rate, and to do that, it's got to do one of those other 3 ways first.